Yes. Welcome to the Assets and Infrastructure Standing Policy Committee here on February the 1st. It's Groundhog Day Eve. I will, first off, I will call to order and we'll get a roll call.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Councillor Carlson. Hello. Councillor Palladino. Present. Councillor Parker. Here. Deputy Mayor Campbell.
I am here.
As you can see, we have a few of your colleagues here present with us. And then online, Mr. Elliott from administration is also online. Thank you.
Thank you. City of Lethbridge acknowledges that we are gathered on the lands of the Blackfoot people of the Canadian Plains and pays respects to the Blackfoot people, past, present, and future, while recognizing and respecting their cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationships to the land. The City of Lethbridge is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Start with the adoption of the agenda from Councillor Palladino. Be it resolved that the agenda of the regular meeting of the Assets and Infrastructure Standing Policy Committee of February the 1st, 2024 be adopted as presented. Councillor Palladino.
Additions or deletions to the agenda? If there are none, I will call for the vote.
Call for the vote. Vote's been called. All in favor? Okay. Consent agenda from Councillor Carlson. Be it resolved that the minutes of the Assets and Infrastructure Standing Policy Committee held on December 7th, 2023 be approved, and the chair and city clerk designate be authorized to sign the same. And further be it resolved that the Assets and Infrastructure Standing Policy Committee receive as information the 2024 to I don't know what that is.
February 1st.
February 1st? Is that what that is? Oh, interesting. Status of initiatives. Councillor Carson. I think that just means February 1st. Okay. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I trust my colleagues have gone through it. I went through the minutes, didn't see anything. Are there any questions on the status of initiatives?
See no questions.
I will call for the vote.
Question's been called. All in favor? And that passes unanimously. We'll begin with presentations, and I understand Adam St. Amand, transportation engineer, about the micro mobility pilot program update. Floor is yours.
All right. So about 2 years ago, the City Council asked us to start a micromobility pilot program. And so for the last 2 years, we've had Neuron operating in the city, and this is kind of the wrap-up talk about what's happened and what our way forward is. Do I have control of slides up here? No? Okay, then I'll go next slide. So as mentioned, 2 years ago we were here. We've had the 2-year pilot. We're coming to an end. Before the pilot started, we did a bunch of best practice research, kind of just figured out what's going on out there in the industry. It's been an evolving industry, and just trying to get an understanding of where people are and what the recommended practices are. There still seems to be a lot of different options out there, and there hasn't really been one consensus moving forward. So we kind of took a direction, went with it, and ran with the pilot. Next slide. So we started off our pilot with a request for proposals. We asked various, we opened it up to micromobility service providers, so e-scooter companies, e-bike companies. We left it open if someone else had some other kind of technology that they wanted to bring in, to bring it in and try it out. We put out the proposal, and one of the key issues was making sure that through this request for proposals and making sure that whoever the provider was going to take on most of the responsibilities related to the pilot. Next slide. So we made sure that they were the ones that were going out to Alberta Transportation to get permission to operate in the roadways. This is e-scooters, for example, don't have any particular legal status within the road, and they need special permissions to actually be able to operate out there. We also made sure that they were providing education for their service, their units, how to ride, what to ride, where to ride, all those different pieces of information. And making sure that they had the right support around for not only customers of the service, but of the public, people in the public who may have had some issues along the way with units improperly parked or something like that. So making sure that that support was there. Next slide. We also made sure that that we're paying in and had some securities. So we have an annual permit fee of $7,500 per year. We also have $75 for violations, so if we get a complaint about a unit being improperly parked and they take too long to go and move it once we've told them to go move it, then they'd get a $75 fine every time that happened. And next slide. And so we put all this in that request for proposals, and then we sent it out and evaluated the proposals that came in. Next slide. And the result of that evaluation was that Neuron was the highest ranked proponent or supplier. And so they came into town, they could operate up to 500 e-scooters and 100 e-bikes. One of the neat aspects of their machines is they have helmets provided on each unit. And one of the things we liked about kind of their approach was that kind of the use of police and bylaw would be a last resort in unit recovery. So if units got stolen or anything like that, they would first go knock on the door, try to recover the units however they could, to hopefully reduce any burden on the police force. Next slide. So our first year, they covered most of the city, and then later in the year expanded down to a limited part of the river valley for some recreational riding. One of the things we wanted was to make sure that they kind of started small and then kept growing out. So even right at the beginning, they didn't have the North Lethbridge in their area. It started off with just the west and the south with downtown and the college and the university. And then quickly the service seemed to take off and they expanded out into North Lethbridge as well and continued to move the boundaries outwards. One of the early issues that we encountered was intoxicated riding. And we worked with the company and they managed to give a solution that seems to have worked. We continued to talk with the police and they said once the solution was implemented that the number of complaints related to intoxicated riding had dropped right off. Next slide. So this year was the first year of our pilot. We had over 160,000 trips, 430,000 kilometers ridden on the e-scooters and e-bikes that they brought to town. There were 40 incidents, and that could be just a unit tipping over all the way to a collision. And there's a few just more stats there. Next slide. And then for city interactions, we did get a lot of calls to 311, well, 131, and a lot of those got redirected to Neuron customer service, as they were simple matters that just kind of took place that the company could deal with. And then a few were also redirected to city staff, which we contacted the company to deal with in a specific way. Next slide. And this here's just a quick summary of those complaints, types of complaints, and what the resolutions were. Next slide. Second year of the pilot, we had the same area and then expanding a little bit more area in the river valley, also expanding out to the northeast industrial areas. And yeah, so it was the second year of the pilot, just that greater coverage. Next slide. Now, these numbers here are a little bit smaller than the previous year, and I think the next slide, if we go there, oh, there's our 311. Also, these numbers here are dropping. Next slide. And again, customer complaints, not as many. Most of them are related to bad parking, and they were in the first year as well. And next slide. Here we go. Here's our comparison between year 1 and year 2. We can see that the number of trips dropped, the number of kilometers traveled dropped, the number of incidents dropped, which is nice to see. And this here, in talking with Neuron, they say this is fairly typical of most markets they set up in. There's kind of this, it's a novelty and everyone comes out and tries it in the first year. And then it drops off a bit in the second year, and this is more or less represents the future steady state of how this will go in the city. Next slide. This here is just a quick map of routes. So this here map, wherever you see the yellows and reds and purples, just shows how intensely a route is used. And so the darker the purple, it's around 5,000 or 6,000 trips over the course of the 2 years. And it just shows us that there's some pretty dark purple, which is kind of indistinguishable up here, but out close to the university along Columbia Boulevard. So it's really well-used area by the scooters. And then across the river along Whoop-Up Drive, and then some of Mayor McGrath Drive and some of 3rd Avenue South. Next slide. So as we got to the end of the 2-year pilot period, we reached out to our internal stakeholders and some of our external stakeholders, including University of Lethbridge and Lethbridge College, downtown BRZ, and just asked them for their feedback, and if we go to the next slide. Most of it was positive. There was an initial wave of concern in that first 3 months, just as people got to see the service, got used to the service, and really got to know the service and how it was going to operate in the city. And as we figured out with Neuron, how best to operate in Lethbridge. And so most of the problems got worked out in that first 3 months, and then it kind of, the number of complaints, number of concerns sort of dropped off after that first 3 months, and then we heard every now and then about it, but it became a much smaller issue. So one of the items that remains a bit of a concern is still riding on sidewalks, just the speed differential between pedestrians and the scooters. So while the e-bikes aren't allowed onto the sidewalks, the e-scooters, we do permit them to operate on the sidewalks. Riding the e-scooters, I don't know how many of you have experienced it. Riding on the sidewalks is often not a greatly pleasant experience with all the expansion joints. It's very bumpy and the roads are often provide for a smoother ride. Next slide. One of the things that we saw was some people using it as an alternate mode of transportation, which was great to see. This is where the bikes came in handy with the baskets on the front. While we don't have any specific numbers, I did hear observations from a few people that they see people getting some groceries, putting them in the basket on the front of the bikes and going home. And next slide. So as far as challenges and experiences throughout, there's a lot of data available. We didn't have quite the capacity to look at all the data all the time. So that was a concern on our side. Although from what we could see, it was, as far as complaints and such, it seemed to go reasonably well. One thing we did notice is that the pilot itself, as far as dealing with complaints and issues that arise, actually seemed to take less time than we thought it would. After that first 3 month kind of learning curve and introduction period, it very much quieted down as far as incoming calls. One of the pieces that is still kind of a big concern is riders improperly parking units. We saw from the numbers earlier that the numbers were fairly high in the first year and then dropped off a little bit in the second year, and it's still an area that we'll have to work with any service providers to address as we continue on, if we continue on with this program. And then there's still people that raise concerns about the units riding on sidewalks and just that speed differential and the comfort level for pedestrians. Next slide. And administration's recommendation, it seemed to run smooth on our end. We would recommend that we keep the shared micromobility services in the city. And that's the end of the presentation.
Thank you. Appreciate the feedback. My first question, I guess I would ask, in the terms of the 2 year, as when you step back, as Neuron looks and steps back and says, knowing what they've known over the years, would you say that they consider this to be quite a success for them?
It sounds like it was successful for them. They seem interested in coming back and are interested in the council decision as to whether we're going to continue allowing the micromobility services in the city. So.
Now, one other thing I was going to ask is about the viability of that type of company, because I've read in news that there's another company that went bankrupt. Is that an issue for Neuron at all, or do you know anything of how sustainable they are?
As far as like good research, I can't comment too much. I am aware of the one company going bankrupt in the States, and a few of the other competing companies seem to have disappeared from the market recently. So it seems like a new industry that's continuing to adjust to whatever the market conditions are.
Okay, I do have some questions. Yes, Deputy Mayor Middleton Hope. Acting Mayor, sorry. I always get you, we look the same.
Thank you, and thanks for the presentation, Mr. Ormond. I appreciate it. Recognizing that this company and other companies like it have gained substantial experience from a number of different cities. I still have some questions in regards to the application here, if you don't mind. I'll start off with the first one with insurance. I am aware of on at least 2 occasions out of the, I think it was 8 that you identified here, where scooters actually ran into a parked motor vehicle. Who is responsible for repairing the motor vehicle?
So that one there, I don't have a clear answer to. This usually ends up becoming a civil issue between the scooter company, the rider, and the vehicle owner. And it's a little bit unclear to me exactly where that.
Yeah, I think it's something that we do need to clear up, because on these 2 occasions that I'm aware of, they drove into the back end of a vehicle, caused substantial damage. One vehicle, the scooter rider actually left his name and contact information, which is a requirement of a collision. The other one did not, so it was a hit and run. I think it would be helpful to have that discussion about who pays for it, who's responsible for it. And I think we really need to impress upon those that are renting the vehicles and so forth, that's part of the communication strategy, that, yeah, you are responsible for it. And so you're responsible to notify the owners, which is the scooter company, that you've had a collision, that you've caused property damage, that you've left your information. If you haven't, then is there a strategy in place to reimburse the person whose vehicle is damaged? And that's something that perhaps we could work on. Second comment, I guess, the $7,500 cost, will this be amended going forward, or is this the fee that is going to be charged to whatever company does the leases the scooters?
So
And how did we arrive at that?
So originally, the $7,500 fee was kind of arrived at as sort of a rough guess of how much time we would likely put into this. What I did at the end of the second year of the pilot is I reached out to all the departments that I was aware of that had some kind of interaction with the scooter company on throughout the pilot, and asked them to estimate how many hours that they put into it. Did some math behind the scenes, and came up to roughly $14,000 in the end over the 2-year period. So the $7,500 registration permit fee seems to be a reasonable estimate of the amount of effort it takes on the city side to administer the program.
Is that an expectation going forward, that it'll still be at that rate or at that level of required service?
For the time being, I think until we have a few more years of experience and knowledge in how much effort it's taking, I think I'd probably keep it at that 7,500 just to make sure that we're safe. A lot of the time ends up coming in with cleaning up a little bit of debris, like helmets or stuff that are lost around, or units that are kind of laying around in parks and stuff like that. So some of it is just kind of ongoing day-to-day maintenance type things for the city.
I'm just looking to see if any of my colleagues I'll cede to Councillor Palladino, but I have a few more questions after. Go ahead, Nick.
Councilor Palladino.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. And thank you for the presentation. I class myself as a supporter of the micromobility project, and especially the scooters, and not so much for the bikes, because they're twice as heavy and they go twice as fast, I think. And I brought this issue up before. I'm concerned about the speed at which the bikes can reach, and some of them hit 50 kilometers an hour. And combined with how quiet they are, I think you can, and you've touched on it here, there's concerns about sidewalk riding. And I think there's going to be a conflict someday that's going to be serious between a bike and a pedestrian, which I become one now. And to me, they're just a motorcycle with a different powered motor. And I'm always looking over my shoulder because they're so quiet. And once again, my wife calls me a cranky old man because I'm complaining about this. But should they be sharing the pathways and sidewalks with pedestrians?
So the bikes should not be sharing the pathways, should not be sharing the sidewalks with pedestrians. They do share the pathways with pedestrians. So the bikes are a motor vehicle under the Traffic Safety Act, and so they're limited to whatever we limit other bicycles to. The bikes are also governed at I believe, the top speed of 32 kilometers per hour, if I recall correctly.
I missed that, I'm sorry.
The bikes, the speeds are governed at 32 kilometers per hour. So while they can get going fast, 32 should be their upper limit. But yeah, the e-scooters are allowed to ride on the sidewalks at this time, and the bikes are not. But yeah, they're both allowed on the multi-use pathways. It's been,
I still support your project, though. I mean,
yep, I just want to say it's been a point of discussion quite a lot, and it still is a point of discussion when we.
I just want to be on the heavier end of the scale.
Yeah.
Thank you. Back to you, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you. Secondary question, and this is actually Councillor Palladino and I were talking about this, so he didn't ask this question, which I thought maybe he would. I do recognize and have experience with the stealth mode of the scooters coming up behind you. Is there an opportunity there to encourage the scooter owner to install some form of mechanism, bells, buzzers, something of that nature to warn pedestrians, as we have on bicycles, to warn pedestrians that a scooter is coming?
They do have them. Now, I think one of the pieces that we might have to look at a little bit more in the future is the education component about getting users to actually use the bells as they come up behind pedestrians.
Bells and whistles. Yeah.
Exactly.
Good. That dovetails nicely into my next question in regards to education. Are we going to continue to provide education to users about the use of helmets and the importance of that, and where they're allowed to actually operate the scooters? As you've indicated, they're supposed to be operating the scooters, the bicycles on the roadway and or bicycle paths, I presume, but scooters are allowed to be operated on sidewalks. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So, but they seem to operate in a variety of different locations, whether it's in parks, on cinder gravel parks, or pathways rather, or paved pathways and so forth. So could we impress upon the company to ensure that there's perhaps enhanced education vis-a-vis the use, the bells, and whistles, as well as helmets and so forth? Can we encourage them to conduct a more comprehensive education strategy with users or potential users?
Yeah, I think that's something that's definitely required and should be an ongoing part of any micromobility program. Just because you've come out and said it once, I don't think is enough, because you're always going to be getting new users. You're going to have users who have been doing it for a while and just forgotten what the rules are because it feels so natural. So a comprehensive education program and an ongoing education program should be an important part of any micromobility service going forward.
Last question is in regards to the impaired operation of these vehicles. I know from conversations that there are people that perceive taking one of these scooters does not endanger them with an impaired driving charge, and they are shocked to find that, in fact, they can be charged with impaired operation of a vehicle. So you mentioned that there was at least 2 occasions when people were apprehended for impaired operation of a vehicle. Were they charged criminally as a result of that? And if so, what type of information goes back again to the operators of these scooters to provide an educational component?
Yeah, I'm not aware of the outcomes of any of the charges or the results from the intoxicated riding, but as far as the intoxicated riding, the scooter company has, I believe the plan or the approach was to, in the evening, move scooters away from the biggest problem locations and basically made them inconvenient to get to as a group. And the problem has dropped off quite substantially since then.
Anything that we learned in the last 2 years that we want to change moving forward?
Not much. I think the pilot went fairly well. It was overall a fairly positive experience, at least as the person on the city side coordinating this. And there's a few tweaks and a few kind of lessons learned as far as, well, for example, the intoxicated riding, and a few ideas with the geofencing where people should and shouldn't ride, and some places to immediately cordon off at the beginning. I believe one of the issues at the start of the pilot was people riding within Park Place Mall and that was quickly resolved by making it a no-ride zone. So that there, just keep remembering some of these smaller details. And that's really the details that need to be implemented. That's where you generate a lot of that concern was just these small pieces of information and having that knowledge to bring forward with if we do continue with the micromobility services.
Well, thanks very much, and good luck with the next year of operating micromobility.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions from anyone? Real quick, Mr. Chairman.
Quick, Mr. Chairman, real quick question. Is the next phase a 2-year project then as well?
So our plan to go forward at the moment is to put out an application process, a little bit different from our request for proposal process, but fairly similar, to solicit companies to put in a proposal to be evaluated in a competitive process, and then to award a permit to the successful applicant. The award would be for right now, we're looking at an award for a 2-year period with option to extend for up to 3 more years. Sorry?
It may not be Neuron, the operator.
It may not be.
Okay.
We're going to open it up to a competitive process again.
Okay, thanks.
Just on that, is there anything about getting a contract with exclusivity? Like they get this and then there's another company that comes in and says, we want to offer this as well. Is that possible?
So the plan is to award 1 permit. Again, just more than anything to keep it easy to manage on the city side. And then from there, we don't have the same exclusivity wording in this permit though, as we did on the previous request for proposals. But having 1 in town to manage and to deal with issues as they come up makes it a much easier process and much less labor intensive for city staff.
Okay. Thank you. Mayor Higgin.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Your question pretty much was the same question I had. Most of the communities I go to have more than, well, I don't think I've been to one that does not have more than 1 scooter provider, I guess, if that's what you want to call it. And so my question is similar. Maybe you can go a little more into that. It's the city time, but it's my understanding that Neuron did give did pay a small amount to be able to cover the time that the city staff took on that. Would that not be available for other companies, and it would just possibly provide a little more, let's say competition, but competition is good, in rather than 1 sole provider for that? I just wonder why we couldn't do something as such.
Yep, it is an option. There's a few pieces that go into this that where if we're thinking the 1 provider is probably the way forward. We're not a great big market. We're a city of 100,000 people, and Calgary, for example, is a city of 1 million people, and they only have 2 or 3 providers, if I recall correctly. So I'm not sure we would be able to support more than 1 provider. And that leads to concerns about quality of service and whether we would get the same quality of service if we start having multiple providers trying to compete with each other on a cost basis. The other piece is, yes, we could have multiple service providers and have them, and they would all pay that $7,500 per year permit fee, and that is an option. The piece there becomes how much staff time are we allocating to it before we need more people dedicated to coordinating this program. On that front, though, definitely open if council does have a direction to have more than 1 service provider, or just limit to 1, or just leave it to administration. Like I said, this is a very much an evolving industry, and we're continuing to gain an understanding of how it works.
Thank you. I just, a comment you made earlier about you don't know how the quality of service may be if there was more than 1. And I would dare say in business, the quality of service is better if there's more than 1. One is trying to outshine the other, and it's just, that's business in general. And so I don't know if I'm if I'm really on that path of we would go down in service if we had to. Furthermore, you're mentioning Calgary, so Calgary, they have a large population, but we have 400 scooters here and it's 2 and 2. I think competition is good. It's important I think within the community, and I think that the service would be better. Not that they're not doing a great job, Neuron. I'm just putting out there that this, as it goes out and you're getting these. And what was the process again called? It's not an RFP. You're doing a
Application process.
application process. I would be much more supportive in actually putting that out and having more than one if they did want to apply. But that's just myself. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions from anyone online or here? I see none. I have thank you, Mr. Mon. Appreciate it. I have from Councillor Carlson. Be it resolved that the Assets and Infrastructure Standing Policy Committee recommends City Council direct administration to continue permit shared micro mobility services in the city. Councillor Carlson.
Thank you. If there's any further debate or questions, I'm open to it. If not, I'll call for the vote.
I see nothing. Question's been called. All in favor? That passes. Thank you. Thank you very much. See nothing. Okay. What's that? Oh, yeah. Next presentation is from Joel Sanchez, Director of Infrastructure Services on water conservation.
Perfect. Yep, thanks for having the opportunity to talk about water conservation and what we have been doing in the city in terms of preparing for a possible water drought during the next spring and summer of this year. Next slide. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the importance of the water for the city, some elements, and then how the water flows to the city, and what are the different reservoirs that we use to get the water, and how that water also moves across the city to other areas, and what other stakeholders are using that water flow. We're going to go through the current situation, and that current situation is changing as we speak. It's like every day things are getting in a different stage. But we're going to go through that and the drought risk. Where are we at, what the province is being working on, and the details that they have in place. I actually have some information that I received yesterday that is not part of the PowerPoint, but I can talk about it. And then we're going to go through the Water Conservation Management Plan and some proposed initiatives that we are going to be working on and bring back to this committee in order to be proposed to City Council. Before I go to the rest of the presentation, I just want to talk a little bit about the staff that has been working on this initiative. As we know, there was an official business motion from Council last Council meeting that Councillor Middleton Hope put forward to work on the next step for water conservation. And we have been working with the province internally for over maybe 6 months now, and also in other initiatives. And we have the Waste and Environment team is been leading this work. And we have here today Mark Spencer, who joined us over a month ago and he has a lot of experience in terms of water and environmental work, and he's working under Mrs. Parker team and Waste and Environment. So they will be the lead to move all the initiatives that we're going to be talking today, and we'll most likely do some of the presentations in terms of the plan. We also have the water and wastewater team. The communications team is also key and important about this, and I will talk about that later. Emergency services, fire, and those departments within the city that they are a key stakeholder, such as park, rec and culture, since they are one of the biggest users that we have within the city. On top of that, we're going to be working also with several stakeholders across the city. Next slide. So when we talk about the water and the importance of the water for the city, we all know is public health and safety, agriculture, industrial and commercial businesses, and the aquatic environment. This is something that has been stressed even by the province in recent meetings, and there are many stakeholders that go across these 4 categories here. Next slide. On this one, we just wanted to show the information of where are the water sources that we're getting for the city. Most of the water that we get is coming from the Oldman watershed and the Oldman Reservoir, which is located in the middle. That water also, the water that we get at the city also comes from the St. Mary, and that keeps going down east towards Tabor and the other communities. If we go to the next slide, this one here is a diagram that shows, again, the different inputs for the water that flows through the city, and also the different stakeholders. We have some of those are the irrigation districts. They the city. And in this diagram, it shows how all the water at the end of the day goes to Saskatchewan. There are requirements that the province have in terms of the amount of water that flows through the river and how much of that needs to be allocated or be conserved for future use down in Saskatchewan. The other point that is really important that I had here that we want to talk about is that the irrigation districts, they account for 97 to 98% of the water being pulled from the river. That's based on the license system. Municipalities across this area, they account for only 2 to 3% of those licenses to pull the water. When we talk a little bit about the license, there is another factor is how those licenses work. And basically, it is on the seniority of the license. If the license is, if the date that license was granted is old, it will have priority over any other license that will be released or approved after that date. When we look at this schedule here, I can say the city license, we have some of the oldest licenses in the watershed. Our licenses are early 1900s, but again, the irrigation districts, they are before us. They are some of them even to 1890s or close to that. So again, not they only have the majority of the rights, but they also have the priority when it comes to exercising the license system that is shown here. Next slide. Current situation, this map is from the province website, and there is a link down there called rivers.alberta.ca that's being updated by the province pretty much on a weekly basis, sometimes even sooner than that. And it shows, if you see on the map, the purple areas are those areas or basins that are in critical water shortage. And most of the areas, as is shown on the slide, are south of Edmonton, and I will say at least close to 40% are in the Oldman River Basin, which is where we are getting our water from. Next slide. This diagram is probably now the one that we had available at the beginning of this month. These numbers have changed a little bit with the recent snow event that we had, but again, that snow event is only, again, it's very minimal. But when we look at the Oldman Reservoir, as I mentioned, the majority of the water is coming from there. In August of 2023, that reservoir had 58% of its capacity. November 2023 was 26. The latest number that I heard on this reservoir was down to a point to 22%, but is now has recovered a little bit, still not close to 30%. So it's still very low compared to the historical value that it has. When we look at the St. Mary Reservoir, again, this number too also has changed a little bit recently, but I believe my understanding based on the latest information we got is still on the single digits, so it's very low. And we are going to go through some pictures to show what it looked like at the end of last year. Next slide. This one here is in particularly on the Bow River area. You can see in July 2022, the water level, and then how it looks like in July of 2023. They are also in dire conditions there. And next slide. This one here is Pincher Creek at Highway 3. Same situation, July 2022 to July 2023. There is a significant reduction on the amount of water available here. Next slide. This one in particular is one that I want to spend a little bit more time, is the Allman Reservoir. As I mentioned before, is probably where the majority of the water coming. If you look at the two bottom pictures, the one on the left is the Collier drinking water intakes. They are actually, there is no water there. This particular area has been trucking water for approximately 4 to 5 months, if not longer than that, because they cannot pull any water from the reservoir. The other picture on the bottom right, it shows the boat launch at the provincial recreation area. Again, there's nothing there, no water. You will need to drive to wherever the area is. If we look at the top picture, everything that you can see on the tan color or the light color, that used to be water on that reservoir. Right now, the water levels, and this picture is old. I know the province was working in a more recent updated picture, aerial picture, but you can see how the level there is significantly low compared to what it has been historically. Next slide. This one is the one we were chatting before in terms of single digits. This is the St. Mary reservoirs, same thing, boat launch on the left side. I guess not too much to talk about it. The picture talks by itself. Same on the other one on the right is from the top of the dam. That water used to be where you see the rocks, and sometimes even on top of the rocks. That's not even close. Next slide. Now, when we look into the water shortage and number that I spoke before, currently we have 51 areas across the province that they are considering water management or water shortage advisory. If we look down again, most of them are located in the Allman water area around Lethbridge, and 31 of those 51 is the number that has increased from early in the summer last year to now. So 20 more areas have been declared in a water shortage. Next slide. So this is some of the elements. In one meeting that we have with Alberta Environment, we were talking about the El Nino and the effects that it will have on the area. Typically, when El Nino is present, we see where we have warm and wet air goes, creating dry conditions. On the right side, you see how those dry conditions are especially visible on BC and Alberta in the mountains. And this is what is causing. We can see even right now, yes, we had a snowfall a few weeks ago, but it only took maybe a week or two for all the snow to be gone. And we don't, if I speak about the snowfall, we really need it in the mountains. That's where we need that to happen in order to make sure we can replenish the reservoirs and that water will flow through. Next slide. So some of the impacts, what we have been talking with Alberta Environment is they have been actively communicating with license holders regarding the situation and expressing the concerns that there are going into the spring of 2024. And they also have been asked to stop taking water due into low level in rivers. And the situation is having an economic and community impact. On this one here, even yesterday, the Alberta Environment issue a letter from the minister announcing that there will be meetings starting as per today to talk about water license agreement or sharing agreements. If Council or SPC recalls, currently the agreements or the use of the license are based on seniority and the date, but there will be a time where that can be overridden by a sharing agreement where, depending on the current stage of emergency, the province will be able to dictate where the use is going to go and what are those priorities. So that's the proactive work that is starting today I believe today they were starting on the central area in the Bow area. Next week will be Red Deer area, and also the city is going to participate in the first meeting for our region next week. So that will be the first meeting to start looking into the water sharing agreements. This is done not only with the municipalities, but also the irrigation districts will participate in these meetings starting next week. Next slide. So this particular one, we use it from the presentation in November from Alberta Environment. I can tell you that at that time we talked about the El Nino winter, the chance of above normal temperatures were 50 to 60%. All this was a forecast at that time. The reality is worse than what we had in that meeting, and we can see now where the temperatures are getting to record levels in some days, and we are in a situation where we really need to start planning for the worst case scenario. And the other thing that I want to mention is that whatever we do, we are trying to use the lens to detach this from the drought conditions, because the reality is that this is happening right now, but next year we might have a lot of water, but the year after we're going to go back to this situation. So we need to make sure this is a culture in order to preserve the water and to do the right thing, and it's not only a one-time event. This will happen over many years. Next slide. This basically talks about the government intervention from the province. There are 3 stages. First one is the education, information sharing, and voluntary measures, which we did some of those last year, and we have been working since then in terms of sharing the information from the different stakeholders. Then the agreements and regulatory tools is the next step, which again started today, and that's the development of those sharing agreements. And the last step will be the declaration of an emergency. And don't get me wrong, I guess no one wants to get there, but we have to be ready and have all the plans in place in case we get there. Next slide. This is where we are today, February 2024. The province is still on stage 4 of the drought management and the emergency process, and that's when there are multiple water management areas. The next step will be to move to stage 5, and that's when the emergency is declared, and we start using those water agreements that are being developed. Next slide. So this one explains what is the typical process. November to December is where we start with the information sharing and key stakeholder meetings. January to March is the development of those agreements between the different stakeholders. March is a key point because typically most of the snow that we get in the mountains is at that time, is in March. And that will be a key decision point. The province has also hired a water management consultant that will do some modeling. And in March, we will know if we need to implement those agreements that are being developed right now. The province will be the one making that call. Next and final checkpoint will be May, June of 2024. This is when we know exactly what the condition is. Are those levels still the same? And then an emergency could be declared by the province at that time. Next slide. So now we move into the Water Conservation Management Plan. This plan was, the water rationing plan was approved by City Council on February 29th, 2016. And it basically has the steps. What happens if we don't have enough water or we have a water emergency? How do we move forward in order to preserve the water? Next slide. And at that time, it was developed with a 4-stage, and it was basically developed thinking on the residential side. We're taking a different approach here. We want to make sure we look at the whole picture. It's not only the residential, but it's also what we call, I'm going to use an analogy that Council is familiar with, is the ICI. If you recall, when we went back to the waste diversion strategy, we divided that between residential and the ICI group. That's industrial, commercial, and institutions. So we really need to look at the whole picture here and make sure whatever we do is updated based on that. And this is the work that Mark and Mrs. Parker are working in terms of bringing all the details, updating this plan, and will be presented to Council later this year. Most likely will be in April. Next slide. So these are some numbers that we pulled together from our data in terms of water production and water consumption. And we were able to split this into the ICI and the residential side. So at the city, you can see here where the total annual water per capita consumption is, in 2021, we had an increase of that per capita to 540, and the red line is the population increase. 2022, that number went down a little bit, and then 2023 started climbing back. If we split this between the ICI and the residential, on the residential side, it was the same pattern. We had a lower number in 2022. 2021, we had a spike in the consumption, and if we do a little bit of memory, what happened in 2021, everybody was at home. That was when the pandemic was happening, and probably the consumption was a little bit higher for many other reasons. What we are trying to do now is to create this awareness. The other interesting number here is that the overall water consumption for 2023 was 20 cubic meter, and that's across the city. There are users that they go over 100 cubic meters a month. There are users that are 10, but the average across the city is 20. And out of that 20%, as I mentioned before, 65% of the households, they use less than 20 cubic meters per month. So the majority of the residents are in that low number. Next slide. Water conservation. This is the next step as well in terms of what are we planning to do. We're going to be looking into what is the residential consumption per capita and what can we do in order to reduce that. If you look at the graph on the top right, the city of Lethbridge is one of the highest per capita consumption after the town of Coaldale and Medicine Hat. That number is over 232. We look at Edmonton, we look at Okotoks and Airdrie, they're around 170. And when you look at the cost, is the table below that, again, same thing. The cost at the city of Lethbridge is one of the lowest compared to those municipalities. When you look at Edmonton, the cost is higher. And the table on the left is some examples of a water conservation strategy from other municipalities and the targets that they have. Most of the time, their targets are around 180 cubic meters per person per year. Next slide. So now we're moving into the conservation initiatives and what are we planning to do and what are we going to bring to council for consideration. So some of the ideas that we're going to be exploring include scaling water rates. And there are two examples like the city of Edmonton and the town of Okotoks. And that's what we have here. Edmonton has a tier 1 up to 10 cubic meters where the water cost is $2.2 per cubic meter. If you move into 10 to 35, then you pay $2.43, and tier 3 is anyone over 35 cubic meters, they pay $3 per cubic meter of water. Okotoks, similar to what Edmonton have, and if you recall the previous slide, you probably see a correlation where their water consumption per capita was the lowest when they have that incentive and that end. So this is something we're going to explore and bring the options for council for consideration and see what model could be implemented. Then there will be other ideas such as residential water conservation rebate programs. There are towns that they do that where you can actually incentivize low flush toilets, you can incentivize rainwater barrels and other systems in place in order to encourage residents to use less water. And the last one is another one that it might be a little bit difficult, but I think we need to start doing this and bring the awareness, is that currently most of the parks irrigation is unmetered, so there is a number there. We are going to start exploring this and most likely come back with metering this because you cannot manage what you don't measure. And this will be something we want to put into the equation and say, what is that cost? How much are we spending there and what opportunities that we have? And the last thing as well is that we also need to walk the talk. So if we're going to ask the community to do something, we're going to try to model that internally. And don't get me wrong, we're going to make mistakes, but we're going to try to address those and learn from what we have done and do it better. Next slide. getting to the last one, so working on the next steps, you will see that there are three distinct working groups going on right now. One is the one that is working on the water rationing action plan update, and that group is focusing on that plan in case we need to get to the emergency. The second group is working on water conservation programs and changes to be presented to council, and there will be a monthly report through assets and infrastructure. This is the group that is going to be working on those initiatives like scaling water rates, water rebate programs, etc. And the last group is probably one of the most important, is the education and outreach. The pictures that we have here today, they speak for themselves. We need to make sure that people know what the situation is, how can they help, and what can we do. So I know that we have our comms team doing an amazing job supporting us here and helping us to convey the message to the community. And I believe that's the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Sanchez. Kind of starking visuals for sure. One thing I was thinking about is I suspect all of these plans should continue, like June. We might get June. We might get a 1995 type of flood again. We get that. This sort of thought is we need to continue with an emergency plan. I think that's pretty important, isn't it?
Yes, that's correct. And in fact, I don't remember if I mentioned that during the beginning of my presentation. The emergency services group is also involved, same as fire and other stakeholders, because this is something that will be in place, not only for, Mrs. Parker is working on other initiatives like climate mitigation and adaptation plans that consider not only the water shortage, but also the flood and other events that may happen. So we're trying to have a holistic approach in terms of how do we get to this.
Thank you. We have questions. Mayor Higgin.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Thank you very much, Mr. Sanchez, for this presentation. I appreciate all the work that's been put into this, because I know we hear all so often, and I get many a communication stating that we're not doing anything, and I want to thank you and your team for the work that's been done, because it's evidence here that that much work. If we could go back to one of the first slides that had all the reservoirs and it had the capacities and stuff. I think it was a third or fourth slide. Yeah, the next one. Oh, where it had the percentages. Yeah. So if we're looking at this, you're saying Oman River, you had a little bit of a spike or whatever. That's at the current number. Is that 26? You didn't actually give numbers. Is that 26 right now? You said it went up a little bit or something, did you not?
Yes, it went actually, before the snow event that we had, it went down to close to 23. And the latest report I heard, we're close to the 26, 27%, so it increases slightly. And that number, when you compare to the normal level at this time of the year, that should be close to 60% to 70%, if not higher. That's the historical number at this time of the year. So we are a third or less than a third of what typically it is.
It's good, but obviously nowhere near where we need it to be. I'm looking at the St. Mary's Reservoir. 4% down to 2%. What is that currently at right now? Single digit, you said, but what was the number of that currently, the latest numbers?
So that number, I don't have it because they haven't released. The St. Mary, they have their own channel to update the number. I know it has increased a little bit, and even the irrigation districts have been talking about that in terms of the allocations that they're planning to do, and they have been having conversations in terms of planning to plant those crops that they don't need that much water. But I believe the latest I heard, and it's not a final number or an official number, it was close to the 10%, not even 10% yet. So we're still on single digits in that one.
All right. And last question, if I could, and then I'll hop out. I do have others, but I'll hop out here. We're looking at water rationing stages here, and you were talking about that. And I know at a provincial level, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure you've been in touch with our provincial partners. We're in stage 4 of 5 as well at a provincial level, and that's stage 5. They can reallocate, my understanding, in conversations, you can reallocate some of that 97-98% that goes to irrigation to city if needed. Is that right if it does hit a state of emergency?
So you are correct in the fact that we are in 4 out of 5, and at 5 is when an emergency is declared, and then the province has the right to reallocate those licenses. The work that is starting today is a proactive work to work with all the stakeholders in order to have those sharing agreements ahead of time. So if we ever need to go there and implement those, that's where, for example, the meeting that the city will be, we have at least 2-3 staff attending next week. There will be the irrigation districts. Everybody will be looking after their needs, and we're going to try to come to a consensus. This is the first of probably 5 or 6 meetings that we're going to have over the next 3 months in order to get there.
Okay, and regardless, and whether we can reallocate or not, that doesn't take away from the importance of us implementing these strategies that you have. And I appreciate the work that you're in there, because whether we get additional allocations or not, we need to make sure that we are moving forward with these strategies. So once again, thank you very much, you and your team, for all the work that you put into this.
Councillor Parker.
For the presentation, Mr. Sanchez. The interesting statistic or interesting number is that 97 and 98%. Simplify this. Could the province just say, farmers, you just got to live with 5% less this year, and we'll compensate you, we'll financially take care of you, you won't get as big as yield this year? Wouldn't that solve the problem? No, it doesn't solve the problem, the reservoirs, but it would solve that's the major place to cut back. Am I correct?
So I can't speak up from the farmers, but I can say that I know that's part of the work that we're trying to do. And to be honest and fair, the irrigation districts, they have been talking about it.
Yeah.
And that's where they have already sent messages to their stakeholders saying, hey, we are here. This is the current situation. Planning for probably taking that message is public. Planning for only having half of the allocation that you historically have had. So that's where that pre-planning in terms of what they're going to be planting is really important, because they might need to get to crops that are less water intensive to cultivate. And the other factor too is that we heavily depend on this agriculture side, right? So that's again is a conservation effort with a mindful effect in terms of what are the unintended consequences that might be.
Yeah, and it seems common sense, but I understand, that the political, the economic impact of the agriculture industry. We all appreciate that. I just don't want people to feel like, well, the city only makes up 1 or 2% of total water use. So like, if I cut back, what does it really play? If the big players are not, it's kind of like, it's always the same thing. The big players have to contribute just as much as the little players. And when I say the little players, I'm thinking the communities, right? Because we only use 1 or 2% of the total water.
Yeah, and I want to also take this opportunity to make a comment here, is that we have been trying to drive that message too. It's not that all the water that we take out of the river and put into the community does not go back, or at least some of it goes back to the river, because we treat the water and then we take everything through the wastewater treatment plant and we put back a percentage. But let's use the analogy of the capacities that we have. We have a capacity up to 150 million liters per day to treat. But our wastewater treatment plant typically is, for most of the part, is like 30% of what you treat. And that is a best practice in any other places. In our case, it's 40 million liters per day. So that means that if we use in a single day 100 cubic meters, we can put almost half of it back. Where when you go to the irrigation side, that's water that you put on the land, and yes, some of it might eventually permeate and go to wells or any other areas, but you don't recover as much as we could do here. So again, municipalities, we have a duty to do the right thing, and that's what we're trying to do. But there are ways to work on this, and the irrigation districts over the last few years, they have done many projects to increase their efficiencies, because I think that's where they need to look at. If they are more efficient in the way they use the water, there is a higher probability that the conservation will have a better result or outcome.
Yeah, and thank you, Mr. Schneider. My last question, I appreciate what the city's doing. Are we going to be enforcing people to use gray water to, like, in the industrial areas, there's some places that use, like, treated water to water all their grass and all that? Are we implementing some plans like that to not only do it for ourselves, or is it logistically just difficult?
So that's an interesting question. Gray water actually is something that is regulated under the province, under the EPA, and is currently not permitted, right?
Oh, okay.
So there are situations or circumstances where that can be permitted, but you need to do an application and justify that you have a treatment process in order to mitigate any possible health risk that is there. Now, with that being said, there are other opportunities that can be done, not so much from the gray water, but on the reuse of the water on the industrial side. And I think I briefly talked a little bit about that last time when the motion was presented. There is opportunity for industry to reuse the water that is coming hot from the process before it goes to the cooling tower, to use it to preheat material that they need to heat and use less steam. So those are the things that we can encourage. It will be hard to monitor and implement. One way or another factor that I have to talk about is currently on the industrial side, we only have one tier, right? And that, actually, no. We have a multiple tier, but that is cheaper as you use more water. That could be something we need to look at and do incentives that if they can reduce their water consumption, then they get a different rate in order to incentivize them doing the right thing. And we are going to explore all those details and come back to council with those possibilities.
Thank you, Mr. Sanchez. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councillor Carlson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Sanchez, for this. Most of my questions actually were already asked. And I do think it's important to reiterate that we do return, unlike many of the irrigation districts, we do return a lot of our water. And my follow-up to that was that 2 to 3% that municipalities use, is that gross or net of that return? Like if we're taking 3% out, is that what we're taking out and actually putting on our lawns or using? Or is that we take out 6 and return 3, so it's 3%?
So that's, again, an excellent question. The number is only based on the license system, which means it's the water we take out.
Right.
That number does not include what we put back. If you put that number, what we put back, that number could be easily a 2. If it's a 3, it could be a 2 or a 2.5 or lower than that, depending on how much is put back into the river.
Thank you for that. Quickly, the first in time, first in right, the fit for water licenses. Do we sort of have an idea? You said we've got a fairly early one, but yes, some of the irrigation districts were in the 1800s. Do we know how much water flow is necessary before, because the first in time, first in right says they get it all. If they have 800 million liters and there's only 800 million liters coming, they get it all. Is that correct?
If you only use that analogy, yes. But when there is a situation that is water scarcity and then you don't have enough in order to get there, that's where these water sharing agreements are coming into place. Again, that's a possibility. It might not happen, but it could happen. And we need to make sure that we do the due diligence to be ready to get there. But it's something that, yes, if that emergency option is not there, they could shut down everybody else. And that's where the province, I don't think the province have never done this to get to that event, and no one wants to get to a point where they dictate, because it will be very difficult to control and enforce and all the other things. That's another element too. Whatever we do and the options that we do, we also need to be mindful on how are we going to enforce that water rationing plan, because we can probably enforce everything outside of the properties when it comes to irrigation. But what happens inside in terms of length of the showers and things like that, that's where that third group that is working in communication and outreach is really important to get there and to convey that message to people.
Agreed. Thank you. I appreciate that we're also looking at ourselves. Because you're right, putting out a message to the community to say, please cut back, and then they see in the park it's pouring rain and our sprinklers are running, is not an appropriate message to send. Was 2022 a wet year? Like, I'm looking at that graph you were showing, and that huge decrease in water usage. Was that we had a lot of rain in 2022, or appropriate amounts of rain? Or I couldn't figure out how it dropped so drastically
I will need to go back and look at the weather temperature. I think one of the analogies that we quickly came into the equation again was that time when people start working from home, staying at home, COVID happened, all this, there was more consumption. And then when you look at 2022, it went back to close to what it used to be before that. So that anomaly was related to the pattern, and we saw that on electric consumption as well. In that case, in our facilities, we saw a decrease because they were closed, but then on the residential households, they went up because people were now all day long in their homes, so they have more opportunity to use more.
I thought they were drinking alcohol, is what I heard. But anyways, and final thought on the scaling of water pricing, which I heartily support. Do any communities do a basic residential amount for free? Water's a right. Water is not just a right; it's a need. Are there any communities that say your basic personal amount of water free? The next liter is $200. Does anyone do that?
Not to my knowledge. So far, what I have looked at is I haven't found one. We're still doing some research. And the main reason when I go back to there, and that's something we're trying to do one more time, we might go back to a cost analysis in terms of how much it costs us to produce that water. So if you don't recover what is costing you to do it, then you go into a financial problem because then you're not really recovering all the cost. But part of this model might be that we look at, if you remember, 65% use less than 20 cubic meter. So that's the number that we need to play and we're looking at. Maybe incentivizing and making a reward for those that are using less and have that number lower than the other one. I don't know if I'm not aware of any $0 for a free amount.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Acting Mayor Middleton Hope.
Thank you. A couple of questions, Mr. Sanchez, and thank you again for the update. Reductions and mitigations. Will this include commercial water reductions in addition to both residential and recreational? And by recreational, I'm talking about the golf courses in the city.
So that will be definitely a group we're going to be having as a stakeholder. What I probably didn't talk too much during my presentation is how the work is going to happen. We actually currently have a survey live for residents to ask about what their knowledge is about water conservation. And then after that, our communications teams together with our Waste and Environment will be working on community engagement and stakeholder engagement. And in case of the golf courses, some of them, they use either the water from the river or from the lakes or ponds that we have, right? So that's not really coming from the plants. It's actually an allocation maybe from the irrigation districts. But still, I believe they are within our region, and we need to work with them and try to get them to do the same thing.
Yeah.
And that's part, again, going back to the incentives. What is the incentives for them to get to that point? And the province, I know they were looking into that as well as part of the stakeholder group. So,
well, it's part of the 2 to 3% that we can actually control. And when we're talking about millions of liters of water that is being utilized for recreational purposes, it's somewhere where we can create some cuts.
yep. And I mentioned too before, rec and culture and parks. That's why they're there, because they are our bigger users, and we need to make sure we think about that.
Good. I have 2 more questions. One is in regards to slide number 25 of 28. It says Lethbridge residential water consumption per capita, I/PP/D. What does that refer to? Here it is. Nope.
Yeah.
25 of
So that will
28?
be liters per capita per day.
Per capita per day. Okay? My last question, and you and I have had conversations about this, but I think for my colleagues and for the public, it may be worthwhile exploring this a little bit. I am led to believe by you that other water basins cannot reallocate water from their water basin to our water basin to help us out without federal government approval. Can you explore that for us a little bit and maybe explain how that might happen? As things become perhaps more difficult to manage, there are water basins within the province that have a greater supply of water than we likely will have coming into the summer and/or in the future. So I'm led to believe by you, I believe, that we can't just simply say the province can reallocate water from another water basin. That's a federal responsibility. Is that correct?
Yes, and I'm gonna try to explain where that comes from. It comes to a physical limitation and geographical limitation. If the water is up north and in the Red Deer region, it will be really hard to truck that or to bring it here. So that's the main one. The other one that I talked about was the federal, and the province is bound for that, is in terms of, if we remember that graph that I have a diagram, all the water that comes in, it also goes to Saskatchewan. That's a regulator in terms of how much water in Alberta can be used and how much has to be sent to the next province. Same thing that happens with BC and us. That's where we have very little control, because that's set by the province and the federal government, and they get those interprovincial agreements. In the basins, there might be opportunities to work on framework, but to share the water again is a physical limitation that will be almost cost prohibitive to do that, to bring water for one way or the other. It will be either pumping or trucking, and that's really, really impossible.
Last question in regards to what the province and/or the federal government might be doing vis-a-vis the 51% of the water that passes through this region that goes to Saskatchewan, as well as waters that flow between the Belly and the St. Mary down into the United States and/or back up into Canada. Are we having discussions, or are we commencing discussions with either the government of Saskatchewan and/or the state of Montana to manage the flow of water through our region?
Again, that's something that is beyond our responsibility, and we cannot really drive this conversation. We have had that conversation with the province, and they are the ones that sit on the table with the the other provinces and the federal government. And I know is a constant work in terms, because again, let's think about that number is based on the water you take from the river. It does not consider the water that is put back into the river. So that was another element we were advocating, saying, hey, listen, we are only allowed to take 50%, but we might be putting back 10%. So how we manage that? And again, we can only advocate about that, but we are not part of the working group. We have any power to change that other than being an advocate and communicate what we think.
Right. So we recognize that both the provincial government and the federal government, they are responsible for the ins and outs of water through our region as it relates to borders and boundaries. However, there is a role for the city to play in regards to advocacy. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. Thank you.
Councillor Carlson.
Chairman, Mr. Sanchez, can we go back one slide here? The possible violation charges. Is that, and I'm sorry, that slide was so tiny and my eyes are so poor, I couldn't figure out any of that. I'm not sure what the green and yellow, or sorry, gray and yellow bars on the left-hand side by the stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, et cetera, say. Can you tell me just what they say? I couldn't zoom in enough.
I can talk about those. So stage 1, basically, it's a community concern, and then the demand reduction target is 10%. The violation charges are a letter and a possible $100.
What is that gray and yellow bar just to the left of it? That's what I couldn't read. You can't read it either. Ha ha.
The vertical ones, if I'm not wrong, is the amount of water. The blue one, the one to the left.
Okay.
We'll need to go back to my slide as well. Because I don't want
Can
to say
anyone read
something
them?
that is not.
I just couldn't read them. Mandy? You know, if somebody can just send that to me at some point, I'd love to just know what that is. It's just for information. But on those, yeah, yes, please. Or new eyes. I'd appreciate either. But the targets, the violation charges. Sorry, did you want to jump in?
Well, I was just going to say if Mandy wanted to come to the microphone
she-
just so we can hear. There's people online, that's all. If you
If you know what they say off, yeah,
Okay,
that's
all right,
why I
okay.
said we'll just
We'll
send
leave
it
it. Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
later, and that way everyone will know. Thank you for that.
What we will do is we'll circulate this, and part of the communications, we're going to have, that's the old plan. That will be changed coming forward, but at least that is the baseline that we're using to do the next stages. When you look at the charges, as I said before, they go in stage 1, $100, stage 2, $200. They pretty much follow the stage, $300 for stage 3, $400, and $500. That number is also being reviewed based on best practices, current dollar amount. Is that a big incentive enough to get there? And that will be presented by the team later when they bring the updated version.
And thank you, Mr. Sanchez, because that was obviously, you're reading my mind. That was going to be my next question. Are those aggressive enough fines? And is that fines for anyone, like a residence, a commercial, an industrial? They all pay the same? Like, if I get a fine because I was watering my cucumbers a little bit, an extra liter a day is not the same as somebody running 4 million liters through their cucumber plant, we'll say. So is that the same or are there different fines for different types of infractions and types of infractors?
I will start, and I welcome Mrs. Parker to add if I miss anything. This particular one here, it was done in 2016 on the residential, so this is only applicable to the residential side. As I mentioned before, we are now working to incorporate in the ICI sector. So if we do that, then at that time, there could be a difference between the charges in one group or the other one, because it's not the same, you're right. Thinking about a big industrial site that has a big green grass area or anything like that where they irrigate and they use, we also need to look into those, and we need to apply the same principle and the same lens across the board, so everybody's doing the right thing.
Thank you. And final question, I think, at this point, Acting Mayor Middleton Hope was talking about it as well. The recreational folks, I see that. I see like some of our recreational facilities, they draw water directly out of either the river or the irrigation pond or what. And how is that monitored? Like, are there any meters on that? I'm sure they have they may have an agreement, who knows, with the irrigation district, but who monitors their use? And the further question is that I've also heard of other different enterprises who actually hook up directly to our hydrants if they're on or near their property and draw unmetered water from those. How is that? Is that a thing you've heard about, or is that ever monitored? And so there's 2-in-1 questions to get around the 2-question rule.
To answer the first one, when it comes to those park irrigation systems, for the most part, they are unmetered.
Unmetered.
Yes, and that's where it goes back to the slide when I was talking about we need to start metering those. And along those lines, it's also every time we do a project, sometimes we have all the medians and all the boulevards, all those areas. They typically are on meter as well. And the work that the team is working on is we need to change the practice. Probably we might need to have different level of service in terms of what we do. Do we need all the bushes? We only need trees. Because there is a cost, and that cost I don't believe is fully considered at this point. And by having the metering installed on the parks, at least will give us that baseline, and this is how much we need. On that note, there is a cost, of course. By retrofitting all those parks, I don't know how many meters are we going to need and the costs associated, but it's something that we're going to be doing the cost-benefit analysis, bringing that forward to say this is how much we need. If we go to the scaling water system, maybe there will be those that are paying more, there will be additional revenue that we can actually use the same principle we use on the waste. Any additional revenue goes back to incentivize the things that we want to do. So that incentive could be either for those incentive programs like low flush, like these type of applications, or it could even be used for capital life cycle that we have right now. So now you're having that increase in revenue to prevent increase in rates for everybody. So many things on that end. The second question was regarding can you remind me again?
It was, there is some unregulated or maybe just unknown use of folks hooking up to our hydrants, et
Yes.
cetera. Is that?
I would love to know if that is happening, because my understanding is that we do have hydrant rental programs where the hydrant sometimes could be used for in case of an emergency or a specific project, but they come, when we do that, they come with a meter. So there should be a charge attached to that. And I'm speaking from the top of my head. I will talk to our water operations group and make sure that what I'm saying here, I can confirm that to council at a later date. That's what I know so far. But I believe there is no unmetered hydrant, especially hydrant connections that we have across, unless there is a particular situation and there should be a reason why that happened, if it happened, but it's not the norm.
And just to follow up on that, if I can, Mr. Sanchez, how would we ever know? Say I've got a hydrant out in front of my house and there's bushes all around it, and I've got the connector from my firefighting friends and I put it. How would you ever know if someone is stealing? Yeah. Yeah. Because, and it's happened in at least a decade ago, I knew of one that was happening quite regularly. And how would the city ever know if somebody is just pulling out water from our system?
Again, I need to check back with the team. I will say if it's a minor use, it will be almost impossible to know. If you have the right tools to operate a hydrant, maybe. But again, I need to talk to our operations team and get there. If it's a large use, then yes, we know the consumption in an area. And that's also another tool that I know the operations team, they use, especially during winter time. They know how much water they typically pump. And if there is a large amount being pumped at one point, well, there might be a water main break somewhere, because that's how they monitor and they communicate that to the operations team. So they actually look into those options.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Do we have any other questions from members of council here or online? I see none. I just want to add my thanks to Mr. Sanchez and your team for coming forward with all this information. And boy, this is a vital part of living in the community as we are right now, so I appreciate all of the work. I have a resolution from Councilor Palladino. Be it resolved that the Assets and Infrastructure Standing Policy Committee recommends City Council receives the water conservation update as information. Councilor Parker. Or Palladino, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You look the
And
same, too.
Thank you, Mr. Sanchez. You certainly haven't painted a very rosy picture for us today, but I don't think it's a big surprise to most of us. Without significant snowfall or rain this spring, we're in deep, maybe not water, but we're in deep trouble. And it's not just the city, but as we know, it's our agricultural partners as well. Less water means less beets, less corn, less cattle, and less potatoes, which means less French fries. And the list goes on. The good news is, if there is any, is that you'll be working with a conservation plan, or on a conservation plan, with recommendations and options starting immediately. And all of us are looking forward to that presentation in about 3 months. So with that, I'll call the question.
Anyone else want to have anything to say? No one does? Call the question. All in favor? Thank you. That passes. And with that, we are adjourned.